The air inside the grand ballroom felt heavy, thick with the scent of expensive perfume, hairspray, and the faint metallic tang of champagne. It was a Friday night in the city, and the old museum hall had been transformed for the annual charity gala. High above the polished floor, crystal chandeliers blazed like artificial suns, casting a harsh, bright light over everything. The room was buzzing with low murmurs, the clinking of glasses, and the soft rhythmic hiss of fabric sliding against fabric as people moved from one conversation to another. Moving through this sea of wealth and color was a young woman named Sophia. She was 24 years old, tired, and holding a heavy silver tray loaded with tall glasses of sparkling water. Her feet, squeezed into tight black shoes that were beginning to pinch her toes, ached with every step she took. She was dressed in a simple black uniform, a stark contrast to the swirling colors of the evening gowns and the sharp cuts of the expensive tuxedos surrounding her. To the people in the room, she wasn't really a person at all. She was part of the furniture, a ghost in a black dress, there to serve and then vanish. Sophia walked carefully, keeping her eyes fixed on the middle point ahead of her, careful not to bump into anyone. She had learned early on in this job that the best way to survive the night was to be invisible. If she didn't make eye contact, she wouldn't get drawn into awkward conversations. If she moved smoothly, she wouldn't spill anything on the ridiculous dresses that cost more than her rent for a whole year. As she circled the room, her path inevitably took her past the far corner, the quietest spot in the entire hall. That was where the piano sat. It was a massive grand piano, black and shiny, reflecting the lights of the room like a dark mirror. It was a beautiful instrument, clearly worth a fortune, but tonight it stood silent and alone. No one was sitting at the bench. The organizers had hired a small string quartet to play background music, so the piano was just for show, a prop to make the room look fancy. Sophia slowed her steps as she approached it. Even though her arms were tired from holding the tray, she felt a familiar pull in her chest, a tight, longing feeling. She had been playing music since she was a little girl. It was the one thing in her life that had always made sense, the one thing that allowed her to express everything she couldn't say out loud. But lately, music had become a luxury she couldn't afford. Her final year at the conservatory was draining every penny she had. Between tuition, rent, and the cost of living in the city, her savings were gone. That was why she was here, walking miles around a ballroom in uncomfortable shoes, serving water to people who didn't even look at her face. She stopped for just a moment near the piano, pretending to adjust the napkins on her tray so she could gaze at the keys. They looked so inviting, so clean and white. She could almost feel the smooth coolness of the ivory under her fingertips. She imagined sitting down on that bench, the way the silence of the room would fall away, replaced by the sound of a melody. For a few minutes, she wouldn't be a tired waitress. She would be herself. "Hey, watch it!" The sharp voice cut through her daydream like a knife. Sophia flinched and quickly stepped aside, realizing she had been standing in the path of a waiter carrying a stack of dirty plates. She murmured a quick apology and hurried away from the corner, her face flushing with embarrassment. She couldn't afford to daydream. She had a job to do. She made her way back toward the center of the room where the crowd was thickest. This was the hardest part of the night. The air here was warmer, filled with the heat of so many bodies in one space. Laughter rang out, loud and confident. Sophia moved through the groups, offering water with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Most people ignored her completely. Some would take a glass without looking, their eyes scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. A few would give her a polite nod, but even then, their eyes would slide right past her, dismissing her instantly. It was a strange feeling being in a room full of people, but feeling completely alone. Sophia watched them interact. The air kisses on cheeks, the firm handshakes, the exaggerated gestures. These people lived in a different world than she did. Their worries were about stock markets, art auctions, and vacation homes. Her worries were about making rent and buying groceries for the week. The gap between them felt physical, like a glass wall she could see through but never touch. As she turned a corner near the bar, she noticed a man who seemed to be louder than everyone else. He was standing in the center of a small circle holding court. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a face that was red from drinking and a smile that showed too many teeth. He had a booming voice that cut through the ambient noise of the party. Sophia didn't know his name, but she could tell he was important. The way people listened to him, nodding and laughing at everything he said, even when he wasn't being funny, told her that. She tried to steer her tray around the outside of his group, keeping her distance. Experience had taught her that the loudest people were usually the most trouble. And I told him, for that price, it better be able to fly, the man shouted, and his group roared with laughter. He took a swig of his drink, his eyes sweeping the room, looking for his next victim, his next audience member to impress. Sophia kept her head down. She just wanted to get through this shift, go home, take off these shoes, and maybe play for an hour on the cheap keyboard she had in her small apartment. That was her reward for the night. That was what kept her going. The orchestra, which had been playing a waltz, finished their song with a flourish and paused to take a break. The room suddenly felt quieter, without the music, making the man's voice even more prominent. Sophia tensed. She could feel something in the air shifting. She didn't know why, but her instincts told her to move away, to head to the kitchen or the far side of the hall. But before she could slip away, the crowd shifted, and she found herself standing right at the edge of the man's circle. There was no one else between them. He looked up from his drink, and his eyes landed directly on her. He didn't look through her the way the others did. He looked at her, his gaze heavy and assessing, like a shopper inspecting a piece of fruit in the grocery store. Sophia froze. She gripped the silver tray tighter, her knuckles turning white. She tried to offer a small, professional nod and turn away, but it was too late. He had already seen her, and he had already decided that she was going to be his entertainment. The man standing in the center of the circle was named Richard, though nobody in the room called him just Richard. To the people holding the champagne flutes, he was Mr. Vance, the tech mogul who had bought half the downtown buildings and sold them for triple the price. He was a man who had spent his life gathering things, companies, real estate, expensive cars, but he seemed to have no interest in gathering friends. Instead, he gathered an audience. Richard took a sip of his drink, his eyes lingering on the young waitress who was trying so hard to disappear. He enjoyed these galas. He liked the way the staff scurried around like ants, making sure his glass was always full and the floor was always clean. It made him feel powerful. It made him feel like the king of his own private castle. But tonight, the feeling was fading. He had told his best stories about his yacht and his trips to Dubai, and the people around him were starting to glance over their shoulders, looking for someone more interesting to talk to. Richard hated being bored, and he hated being ignored. He needed something to spice up the night, something to shock the laughter back into the room. He watched the girl closely. She looked young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun and a face that looked tired but serious. She was holding a heavy tray with one hand and adjusting a napkin with the other. There was a look in her eyes that Richard recognized. It was the look of someone trying to survive. He had seen that look 1,000 times in business, usually right before he signed a deal that took everything from the other person. He decided he would have some fun at her expense. It was easy, it was cruel, and to him, it was just a game. "Hey there," Richard said, his voice booming across the small gap between them. Sophia stopped walking. She knew that tone. She had heard it before from drunk customers late at night at the diner. It was the tone of someone looking for trouble. She took a small breath to steady herself, and turned to face him, keeping her expression neutral. "Yes, sir," she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Can I get you another water?" Richard laughed, a short, barking sound that made a few people jump. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. He could smell the stale alcohol on his breath, mixed with the strong scent of expensive cologne. "I don't need water, sweetheart," he said, looking her up and down. "I need some entertainment. This party is dead. The music is boring. The people are boring." He gestured vaguely at the string quartet, who were quietly packing up their instruments. "You look like you know how to work hard. Do you know anything other than carrying trays?" A few of the people in the circle shifted uncomfortably. One woman, wearing a sparkly blue dress, looked down at her phone. A man in a gray suit cleared his throat and looked away. They knew what was coming, and they didn't want to be part of it, but nobody wanted to be the one to tell Richard Vance to stop. Sophia felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she refused to look away. She had dealt with rude customers before. She knew the best way to handle them was to be polite, answer quickly, and leave. "I just served the drinks, sir," she said. If you need the bartender, he is right over there." She pointed toward the bar, hoping he would take the hint and leave her alone. But Richard didn't move. He was enjoying this. He liked seeing her stand there, trapped by the tray she was holding, unable to walk away without being rude. "See, that's the problem with you people," Richard said, turning to his friends as if he was telling a joke. "You do the bare minimum. You work hard, sure, but you don't know how to make money. You don't know how to be successful." He looked back at Sophia. "I bet you've never seen $100,000 in your life, have you? I bet the most expensive thing you've ever touched is the silver tray." The group let out a few nervous chuckles. Sophia tightened her grip on the tray. Her palms were sweating, making the metal slippery. She thought about her bank account, which was currently empty. She thought about her tuition bill, which was sitting on her kitchen table at home, unpaid. She thought about the worn-out second-hand keyboard she practiced on every night. He was right in a way. She was broke, but he didn't have to humiliate her for it. "I need to get back to work, sir," she said, turning her body slightly to the side. "Not so fast," Richard said. He reached out and tapped the side of her tray, making the glasses clink together. "I'm not done talking to you. I have a proposition for you." He pointed a finger toward the corner of the room, toward the silent black piano. "See that piano?" Richard asked, his voice getting louder so that people nearby turned to look. "I love music, real music, not that boring string quartet stuff. I bet you think you're tough because you work hard, but I bet you have no talent. I bet you're just average." Sophia looked over at the piano. Her heart gave a little skip. That was her territory. That was the one place where she wasn't just a broke waitress. But she knew that wasn't what he was asking. He wasn't asking for a concert. He was setting a trap. "I play a little," she admitted quietly. "Oh, you play a little?" Richard mocked, stretching out the words. "That's cute. Hey everyone, listen up. She plays a little." A few more people stopped their conversations to watch. The tension in the air was thick now. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion. Everyone knew it was wrong, but they couldn't look away. "Here is the deal," Richard said, a greedy smile spreading across his face. "Go over there, sit down, and play something. If you can actually play a real song, not chopsticks, I will give you $100, cash, right now." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. He waved it in the air like a flag. "Come on," he taunted. $100 for 5 minutes of work. That's better tips than you'll make all night carrying glasses of water." Sophia stared at the money. $100 would buy her groceries for a week. It would pay for her subway pass. It was a lot of money to her. But she knew it wasn't about the money. It was about the power. He wanted her to dance for him like a monkey. He wanted to prove that he could control her, that he could buy her dignity for the price of a nice dinner. "Sir, please," Sophia said, her voice shaking slightly now. "I have guests to serve. I can't just leave my post." Richard's face hardened. The playful look disappeared, replaced by a cold, angry stare. He didn't like being told no. He was used to people saying yes to him, no matter what he asked. "I wasn't asking," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "I told you to go play. Or are you too scared? Are you afraid you're going to embarrass yourself? Are you afraid you're going to embarrass yourself? Are you afraid that once you sit down there, everyone will realize you're just a fake?" He leaned in closer, so only she could hear the next part. "You're just a waitress. Don't try to be something you're not." The words hit her harder than she expected. Just a waitress. That was all she was to him. That was all she was to most people here. They didn't know she spent 4 hours a day practicing scales. They didn't know she could hear melodies in her head when she walked down the street. They didn't know she had sacrificed everything to be a musician. Sophia looked around the room. She saw the pity in some eyes, the amusement in others. She saw Richard waiting for her to back down, waiting for her to run away to the kitchen, so he could laugh about her with his friends. Something inside her shifted. The fear was still there, mixing with the anger in her stomach, but suddenly the fear felt smaller. She looked at the piano again. It was just sitting there, waiting. It was an instrument of truth. It didn't care who was rich and who was poor. It didn't care about suits or uniforms. It only cared about the music. She realized that Richard wasn't trying to hear music. He was trying to break her spirit. And if she walked away now, he would win. He would go back to his friends and tell them how he scared the little waitress, and they would all laugh, and Sophia would go home and feel small. She slowly lifted the tray off her shoulder. She walked over to a nearby high table and set it down with a soft clink. The movement was calm, deliberate. "Are you quitting?" Richard asked, raising an eyebrow. "Giving up already?" Sophia turned to him. Her face was flushed, but her eyes were clear. For the first time that night, she didn't look at the floor. She looked him right in the eye. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I'm going to play." Richard grinned, thinking he had won. He waved the $100 bill in the air. "Atta girl. Let's see what you got. Don't disappoint me." He had no idea what was about to happen. He thought he was about to watch a joke unfold. He didn't know he was about to wake up the entire room. Sophia began to walk toward the corner of the room where the piano sat in silence. With every step she took, her shoes clicked softly against the polished floor, a rhythmic sound that seemed to match the beating of her own heart. The distance between the bar and the instrument felt much longer than it actually was. It felt like walking a tightrope without a net. Behind her, she could hear Richard moving. He wasn't staying put. He wanted a front row seat to the humiliation he thought was about to happen. He was talking loudly to his friends as he followed her, making sure everyone nearby knew what was going on. "Make way! Make way!" Richard announced, his voice full of mocking excitement. "We have a concert. Exp. ein net, a special performance by the Help." He waved his hands, gesturing for people to clear a path. A few guests stepped back, looking awkward. Some sipped their drinks nervously, while others outright stared at Sophia with pity or curiosity. She could feel their eyes burning into her back. She was the center of attention now, but not in a way she had ever dreamed of. Usually, when she imagined performing for a crowd, she imagined them sitting in quiet reverence, waiting to be moved by the music. This was different. This crowd was waiting for a mistake. They were waiting for a cringe-worthy moment that would give them something to whisper about on the ride home. Sophia kept her head high. She forced herself to breathe in and out, deep, slow breaths that calmed the shaking in her hands. She thought about the dusty practice rooms at the conservatory, rooms that smelled of old wood and rosin. She thought about the hours she had spent there, playing the same difficult measures over and over again until her fingers bled. She had played for professors who were strict and cold, for judges who held pens above scorecards, ready to mark her down for a single wrong note. This was just another performance. It didn't matter that the audience was rude. It didn't matter that the critic was a drunk millionaire in a suit. The music was the same. The notes were the same. She reached the piano and stood before it. Up close, the instrument looked even more magnificent. It was a sleek, black beast of a machine. The lid was propped open, reflecting the chandeliers above like a mirror. The keys looked pristine, white and black, waiting for a touch. Sophia turned around to face the room. She saw Richard standing just a few feet away. He was leaning forward slightly, a cruel smile plastered on his face. In his hand, he still held the $100 bill, waving it slyly as if to tempt a dog with a treat. His friends were gathered behind him, whispering and giggling. "Go on then," Richard said, nodding his head toward the bench. "Sit down. Let's hear this masterpiece." Sophia didn't look at the money. She didn't look at his friends. She looked at the keys. She reached down and smoothed the fabric of her uniform skirt. It felt strange to be sitting at a concert grand in a waitress outfit, but she pushed the thought away. Clothes didn't make the musician. Heart did. She sat down on the bench. It was firm and comfortable. She adjusted the height, instinctively reaching for the knob under the keyboard. It was a habit, something musicians did without thinking. She was surprised to find the bench perfectly adjusted already, as if the piano had been waiting for her. She placed her hands on her knees for a moment. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of the room champagne, perfume, and the faint smell of floor wax. She closed her eyes for just a second. In that second, the noisy ballroom faded away. She imagined she was back in her small apartment, safe and alone. She imagined the stress of the rent, the rude customers, and the heavy trays all dissolving into smoke. All that existed was the music. She opened her eyes and placed her fingers on the keys. The silence in that corner of the room was heavy. Everyone was watching. Richard checked his watch, then looked back at her, raising his eyebrows as if to say, "Well, I haven't got all day." Sophia didn't start immediately. She let her fingers rest on the cool ivory for a heartbeat, getting a feel for the instrument. Pianos had personalities. Some were light and responsive, others heavy and stubborn. This one felt responsive, alive. It was ready to sing. She decided she wouldn't play something simple. She wouldn't play Happy Birthday or a nursery rhyme to satisfy his low expectations. She wouldn't play a pop song they could hum along to. She was going to play the piece that lived in her soul, the piece that she played when she was sad and needed to let it all out. Without giving Richard or the crowd another glance, Sophia let her hands drop into the opening chord. It wasn't a gentle start. She struck the keys with a confidence that shocked everyone who was watching. The sound wasn't clumsy or hesitant. It was a deep, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and up into the ceiling. It cut through the chatter of the room like a thunderclap. The guests who had been whispering stopped mid-sentence. The man who had been checking his phone froze. Richard, who had been opening his mouth to make a snide comment about her posture, snapped his jaw shut. The sound was big, rich, and full of an emotion that nobody expected to hear from a girl in a black uniform. Sophia didn't stop. Her left hand began to move immediately, establishing a rolling, rhythmic bass line that was fast and steady. Her right hand began to weave in the melody, notes cascading down like rain, but not the sad kind of rain, the kind that washes the world clean. It was Chopin. It was technically difficult, demanding speed and strength, but she made it look effortless. Her fingers, which had been sore from carrying trays just minutes ago, were now flying across the keys with a life of their own. They danced, they leaped, they pressed deeply into the keys to pull out the singing tone. The music was complicated, full of twists and turns. It wasn't background noise anymore. It was a living, breathing thing that demanded to be heard. The reaction in the room was instant. It started with the people standing closest to her. Their heads turned, their eyes widened. The expressions of pity and amusement were wiped away, replaced by looks of surprise and genuine awe. The music was too good to ignore. It had a gravity to it, pulling the attention of the room toward the corner. Toward the corner. The string quartet members, who had been packing up their instruments in the back, stopped what they were doing. The cellist stood holding his bow in midair, listening. The first violinist turned her head, a look of professional respect on her face. Sophia didn't notice any of this. She was in the zone. She was inside the music. She could feel the vibration of the strings through the bench, humming against her legs. She played the fast, technical runs with precision, her fingers hitting every note perfectly. She let the melody soar in the high registers, ringing out clear and bright like a bell. Then she brought it back down, deep into the bass, playing with a heaviness that made the audience hold their breath. She was telling a story with her hands. It was a story of struggle, of climbing a mountain, of falling down and getting back up. It was passionate and intense. It was the sound of everything she had been holding inside for months. The fear of not making it, the exhaustion of working 2 jobs, the dream of something better. She poured all of it into the piano. The contrast was stark. Just a moment ago, the room had been filled with the shallow noise of rich people bragging about money. Now a raw, powerful talent was filling the space, silencing the pretentiousness. The music was more real than anything Richard had bought or sold in years. It was honest. Richard stood there with his mouth slightly open. He looked at the $100 bill in his hand. Then he looked at Sophia. He had expected her to fumble. He had expected her to play a simple, clumsy tune and give him an excuse to laugh. This was not what he expected. He didn't know much about classical music, but he knew quality when he heard it. He knew that you couldn't make a sound like that by accident. It took years. It took dedication. It took a soul. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a feeling he didn't recognize. It was a sinking feeling. The smirk was gone from his face, replaced by a slowly reddening complexion. He realized with a dawning sense of horror that he wasn't the one in control of the room anymore. The girl in the black dress was. And she didn't need his money. She didn't need his money. She didn't need his permission. She had her own power, and it was far greater than his. The music filled the vast ballroom like a rising tide, drowning out the clinking of silverware and the low hum of polite conversations. What started as a corner of curiosity was rapidly becoming the center of the universe for everyone inside the museum hall. The melody was complex and fast, cascading down the keyboard in a shimmering waterfall of notes that seemed impossible for human hands to play, yet there Sophia was, playing them with a focused intensity. Sophia had her eyes closed now. She didn't need to see the keys. Her fingers knew the way, guided by years of practice and a deep love for the piece. She was no longer thinking about the people watching her. She wasn't thinking about Richard, or his cruel smirk, or the $100 bill. She wasn't thinking about her empty bank account, or the pile of bills waiting on her kitchen table. For these few minutes, she was completely free. The music was a language she spoke fluently, and for the first time that night, she was able to say exactly what she wanted to say. The crowd around the piano had grown significantly. People were drifting over from the bar, from the buffet tables, and from their quiet corners. They were drawn in by the sound. It wasn't just background noise anymore. It was something commanding and beautiful. Waiters stopped in their tracks, holding trays high, their faces turned toward the music. Even the man who had been complaining about the stock market earlier had gone silent, his phone forgotten in his hand. Richard, however, did not move. He remained rooted to the spot, but his composure was cracking. He was looking around the room, realizing that he was losing his audience. The people who had been laughing at his jokes just moments ago were now ignoring him completely. Their attention was entirely on the young woman in the black uniform. Richard felt a hot flash of irritation mixed with confusion. He didn't understand classical music. He didn't know the composer or the history of the piece, but he knew power, he knew presence, and he could feel the power shifting away from him. He looked back at Sophia. Her face was transformed. The tiredness, the submission, the bland politeness, it was all gone. In its place was a look of fierce passion. Her swayed slightly with the rhythm, her body moving with the instrument, rather than just sitting on top of it. She looked like a queen on a throne. It made Richard feel small. It made him feel like the bully on the playground who had just realized the quiet kid in the back knew how to fight. "Play louder," someone whispered from the crowd, though they didn't need to. The sound was already projecting to the farthest corners of the hall. The acoustics of the museum were perfect for the piano, carrying every nuance of the tone. The deep bass notes vibrated through the floor, while the high notes sang crystal clear. Sophia moved into the slower, more emotional middle section of the piece. The tempo slowed down, and the mood shifted from frantic to deeply melancholic. The melody became a cry, a longing sound that tugged at the heartstrings of everyone listening. You could hear a pin drop in the room. The silence was heavy, filled only by the singing of the piano. It was a moment of pure vulnerability. Sophia was pouring her heart out, exposing her soul to a roomful of strangers who had judged her simply by the clothes she wore. This was the part Richard hated the most. He hated feelings. He hated things that couldn't be bought or controlled. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, feeling incredibly awkward. He looked at the $100 bill in his hand. It looked ridiculous now. It looked insulting. He quickly folded it and shoved it deep into his pocket, hoping no one had noticed he was still holding it. He tried to catch the eye of one of his friends, maybe to roll his eyes or make a snide comment, but nobody was looking at him. They were all mesmerized. The music began to build again. The soft notes grew stronger. The rhythm became more driving. Sophia's hands flew across the keys, moving faster and faster. The difficulty of the music was immense, requiring a strength and dexterity that seemed impossible. Her fingers were a blur of motion, hammering out chords that rang out like church bells. The intensity was rising, pulling the audience along for the ride. They were no longer thinking about the charity gala or the champagne. They were holding their breath, waiting to see where she would take them next. Near the back of the room, an older woman in an elegant fur coat wiped a tear from her eye. She had been attending these events for decades and had heard the best musicians in the world play in concert halls. She leaned over to her husband and whispered, "Who is that girl? She plays like an angel." The husband shook his head, equally entranced. "I have no idea. She was serving us water 10 minutes ago." The contrast hung in the air. This was not a performance bought with a ticket. It was a raw, unexpected gift. It was the magic of the human spirit, breaking through a mundane, rigid social structure. Sophia wasn't playing because she was paid to do it. She was playing because she had to. She was playing because she had to. She was playing to prove to herself that she existed. Richard was beginning to sweat. He felt a trickle of moisture run down the side of his face. The room felt hot, or maybe he was just burning with embarrassment. He replayed his own words in his head. I bet you have no talent. I bet the most expensive thing you've ever touched is this tray. The words echoed in his mind, mocking him. He had tried to make a fool of her, but instead he had made a fool of himself. He had challenged a master and he had lost in front of all the people he cared most about impressing. He thought about leaving, just turning around and walking out the exit, but his feet wouldn't move. He was trapped by the sound, caught in the gravity of the performance. He had to stay and see it through. He had to face the music. Sophia approached the climax of the piece. Her body was swaying, her left hand crossing over her right to reach the deep bass notes. Her posture arched forward as if she was willing the sound into existence. The volume was incredible now, filling the huge space without a microphone. The piano was roaring, a beast unleashed. It was powerful, angry, and triumphant all at once. She thought about the nights she spent scrubbing floors. She thought about the hunger pangs she ignored to pay for her lessons. She thought about the people who told her she wasn't good enough, that music was a hobby, not a career. She poured all that rejection into the keys, turning it into something beautiful. Every strike of the key was a defiance. Every chord was a victory. The people closest to the piano could feel the vibrations in their chests. It was a physical experience. A young child, who had been bored in tugging on his mother's dress, stopped and stared, his mouth open, completely captivated by the energy radiating from the stage. Richard looked at the child, then back at Sophia. He saw the way the girl's face shone with sweat and effort. He realized that this was hard work. It was harder than any meeting he had ever sat in. It was harder than any deal he had ever closed. This was pure, unadulterated effort and talent, stripped of all the fake polish of the party. He felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in his gut. It wasn't anger anymore. It was respect. It was grudging, unwilling respect, but it was there. She was almost at the end. The tempo was frantic, the notes rushing toward the conclusion like a river heading toward a waterfall. The audience was on the edge of panic, caught up in the sheer speed and power of it. They couldn't look away. The room was completely hers. The billionaire, the socialites, the waiters, the guests, they were all just spectators in her world now. Sophia felt the energy of the room, but she didn't let it distract her. She focused on the final run. It was a series of descending notes that led to the last resonant chords. She took a deep breath, tensed her muscles for the impact, and let her hands fly. She brought them down on the keys with force, playing the final sequence of chords. Bum bum bum. The sound rang out, majestic and final. She held the chord, letting the notes hang in the air, vibrating through the hall. She didn't lift her hands immediately. She sat frozen, her hands on the keys, letting the silence after the storm do its work. The silence that followed was louder than the noise before. It was a heavy, awestruck silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The sound seemed to linger in the rafters, refusing to fade away completely. Sophia sat there, her chest heaving slightly, her hair falling loose from her tight bun. She slowly opened her eyes and looked out at the sea of faces, seeing them clearly for the first time since she sat down. The final vibration of the piano string faded into the high ceiling of the museum, leaving the room in a state of absolute, breathless silence. For a few seconds, nobody moved. It was as if the entire crowd had been placed under a spell, stunned by the raw beauty and power of what they had just heard. The air, which had previously been filled with gossip, bragging, and the clinking of glasses, was now heavy with awe. Sophia sat on the bench, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her hands were still resting on the keys, trembling slightly from the exertion. The adrenaline was pumping through her veins, making her fingers buzz. She slowly exhaled, the sound loud in the quiet room, and lifted her hands from the ivory. As the spell broke, the reaction wasn't just polite applause, it was a wave. It started near the front, where the older guests stood, and swept through the room like a storm. People began to clap, slowly at first, and then loudly, enthusiastically. It wasn't the clapping you give to a waiter who does a trick. It was the clapping reserved for an artist. Sophia blinked, the bright lights of the chandeliers momentarily blinding her. She stood up, her legs feeling a little shaky. She looked out at the sea of faces. No one was looking through her anymore. Everyone was looking at her. Richard was standing a few feet away, his mouth slightly open, his hands hanging limp at his sides. His face was a mixture of shock and embarrassment. The $100 bill he had taunted her with was still crumpled in his pocket, completely forgotten and worthless. He looked around at his friends, expecting them to share a knowing glance, to wink and confirm that it was just a joke. But they weren't looking at him. They were clapping for the waitress. They were smiling at her. Some of the women in the circle were actually wiping tears from their eyes. Richard realized with a sinking feeling in his gut that he wasn't the king of the castle tonight. He was the fool who had tried to mock a master and lost. He shrunk back, trying to make himself smaller, wishing he could dissolve into the wallpaper. Sophia didn't look at Richard. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her gloat. She didn't smirk or nod in his direction. Instead, she offered a small, modest nod to the room, a silent thank you for their attention. Then she turned back to the piano bench. She carefully smoothed the fabric where she had been sitting, treating the instrument with the same respect she had shown it while playing. It was a small act, but it showed her character. She honored the music more than the applause. She turned and walked away from the piano. The crowd parted for her, creating a path where there hadn't been one before. Waiters stepped aside, and guests turned their bodies to let her pass. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was the main character. As she walked, she felt the change in the atmosphere. People were whispering, but not behind her back. They were saying her name, or at least trying to find out who she was. That was incredible. A man in a tuxedo whispered as she passed, absolutely breathtaking. "I've never heard anything like that," a woman added, her voice full of genuine wonder. Sophia kept her head up, but she didn't stop to chat. She needed to get back to her station. She needed to ground herself in reality again. As she moved toward the high table where she had left her tray, she saw Richard's friends. They stopped clapping as she approached. One of them, a younger man with a flushed face, actually looked down at the floor, ashamed of how he had laughed along with the insults just minutes before. She reached the table and picked up her silver tray. It felt heavy again, grounding her. She wasn't a concert pianist with a manager in a dressing room. She was Sophia, the waitress. But she was a waitress who had just changed the mood of the entire party. She decided to return to the floor. She didn't run away to the kitchen to hide. She walked back into the center of the room, weaving through the guests. But this time, when she offered water, people didn't look through her. They took the glasses with 2 hands. They looked her in the eye. They smiled at her. "Water, sir?" she asked a man near the bar, her voice steady. The man turned, recognized her as the girl from the piano, and his face lit up. "Yes, please," he said softly. "You were remarkable, truly." "Thank you," Sophia said simply, moving on. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Richard slipping away toward the exit. He didn't say goodbye to his friends. He didn't finish his drink. He was leaving with his tail between his legs, defeated by a melody. Sophia watched him go for a brief second, feeling a surge of relief rather than anger. He was gone. The heavy weight of his judgment had lifted from the room. The rest of the evening felt different. The string quartet, who had been packing up, seemed inspired by her performance. They started playing again, with more energy and feeling than before, but the guests kept glancing toward the empty piano bench, remembering the girl who had turned a boring gala into a night they wouldn't forget. Sophia worked until the very last guest left. Her feet were sore, and her arms were tired, but her heart felt light. When the final glass was cleared and the lights began to dim, she went to the back room to clock out. She hung up her black uniform and put on her jacket. It was a cheap worn jacket, not a designer coat, but she pulled it around her shoulders with pride. She walked out of the museum into the cool night air. The city was quieter now. The streets were damp, reflecting the streetlights, but the air felt crisp. Sophia took a deep breath. She was exhausted, but she felt strong. She had faced a giant that night, and she hadn't backed down. She had shown them that you can't judge a book by its cover, and you can't put a price tag on talent. She began the long walk to the subway station. In her pocket, her fingers brushed against her phone. She thought about the conservatory applications sitting on her desk at home. She thought about the rejection letter she had been terrified of receiving. Tonight gave her hope. If she could move a room full of strangers to silence and applause, she had a chance. She had a real chance. Sophia smiled to herself as she walked down the street. She didn't have Richard's $100, and she didn't have his expensive suit, but she had something he would never have. She had her music, and she had her dignity. And as she disappeared into the city lights, the sound of her melody seemed to linger in the air, a reminder that true class isn't about how much money you have, but about what you do with the gifts you've been given.